Hello and welcome to my latest video. This time I'm going to be painting one of the knights from the new Adeptus Titanicus game. So they're shrunk down versions of the 28mm scale knights from Games Workshop. So the scale of these is supposed to be 8mm, I think. But anyway, regardless of that, I'm going to be painting one of these in the house Malinax colour scheme. And to start off with, I've primed the model black, and I've quickly painted in the metallics. Now, don't worry too much that you've missed how to paint in the metallics at this stage, because all it was is a case of using Vallejo Model Air gunmetal and covering all the metal areas on the model, and then giving it a wash of Agrax Earthshade. So completely nothing special at all. It's just, you know, to get through those early boring stages where there's not much happening. So I'm just starting off painting all the armor plates with Balor brown, and you can see that in the on the wet palette in the top left of your screen there. It's the darkest of the three colours at the bottom. See, the brush just went in it there. Now, what you're going to find is that I'm going to spend quite a while painting in all these tiny little armor plates, and then I'm going to get bored of it when I start painting on the carapace, and that's because I'm rather foolishly painting on a black base coat. Now, the black helps for moving along with most of the model. You know, you get like dark outlines. It's easy to do the all the metal and things like that when it's all got a black base coat. But if you're painting Balor brown over the top of it, and indeed a lot of light colours, you'll find that you have to give them a lot of coats just to get a strong colour. Strong opaque colour, sorry. And what you'll also find is that as you keep doing these layers, so you'll be able to see the brush strokes and things, and it just takes a long time to build it up. And it's important that when you're doing those built up layers, that you don't have the paint too thick still, because you'll make the paint, well, it'll become kind of textured. So you still have to keep the paint fairly thin while you're doing it, or something like single cream. And it just takes a long time to do it, and because I'm doing these for gaming with as well, it's not really worth it. So what I did was I eventually will use an airbrush just on the top carapace section, and it's just to fill it in a little bit. You'll see when we get there, but until that point it is basically just picking out all the armor plates in Balor brown. You might find it's a bit tricky while painting them, because the new models are downscaled from the original 28mm ones. The details are actually very small on them, and so actually you have to look very carefully on how things how the shapes actually work, especially around the trim, the lower legs with the metal trim, or rather it's mostly painted metal trim, but actually because this is house Malinax, I'm going to paint all the trim black, but that'll actually turn out to be kind of grey, so that it's not just flat black. But yeah, so some of the details are very small, and it's a bit different. So you might think, well, it's roughly about the size of a Space Marine or whatever to paint a model like this, so it shouldn't be too bad. And that is true, that it is about the size of a Space Marine, but the difference in scale of the details mean that most of the details on the model are actually much smaller than those that you would find on a Space Marine, and there's a lot more of them as well. So it just makes it that tiny bit more time consuming to pick them out. But yeah, apart from that, at the moment it's just a case of layering up the Balor brown. Now, what also you're going to find while I'm painting the shoulders here is I'm painting each panel, and the reason for that is that I wanted them to be separated out. You know, so you get the dark line in between each panel, because that makes life a bit easier. But because I got a little bit bored painting the layers, when I use the airbrush on top, it does actually go over those lines as well. but I decided it would be quicker to get the smooth coat on quickly on the carapace and shoulders than to make sure that all the lines were separated. So to combat that, I put a wash of Agrax Earthshade over the whole model. So I'm jumping a little bit ahead there, but you'll see as we get there. But also, I mean, this is a good time actually to just take a step back and look at what I mean about the layers being built up, especially on the shield there. So the shield has had one coat of paint on. You can see how it's very streaky. You can see the black coming through, and things like that. And so part of the reason for that is it's a layer paint. Now Games Workshop have the paints separated out, so they have base and layer and all sorts of things like that. But this was the colour that I wanted, so I've used a layer paint, so it's not quite as pigment heavy as the base paints. Now other companies have different formulas and things. I know that Vallejo, they have a extra opaque range of paints for their game colour series, and those are very good. They're a kind of fantasy range of paints. So Vallejo have two types of paints. They have lots of types of paints, but the two main ones are model colour and game colour. Now game colour are designed to compete with Games Workshop and have fantasy type colours on them, but they are a different formula and they're not quite as thick usually. Now the extra opaque, I think, are direct competition to the base layer paints, or the precursors to the base layer paints. But basically it just means that they have extra pigment. They're more opaque when you paint them down. So here you can see now, after all that waffling, I've caught up and finished doing the layers. So you can see where I've used the airbrush on the top carapace because it's gone over some of the black lines and things. Now I didn't mask any areas off, basically because the top of the little knight is basically the whole of the carapace. I can just airbrush directly top down, and there's no concern about much overspray, so I didn't have to bother masking anything. And here I'm just giving it a nice wash of Agrax Earthshade. Normally I don't use things like washes and things like that, but again, it's more of a gaming piece, although I'm going to be spending more time on it than I should for a gaming piece. But I think once I've finished painting this one, I will have got a technique down where I can go a lot faster. So here you can see that I'm covering the whole thing. Now, it did occur to me after that I covered the whole thing that I didn't need to cover the whole thing at all, because I'm actually going to pick these colours out more. And actually what I could have done is just painted in all the edges, all the lines in between the panels. It would have had the same effect that I wanted. Just go around all the details and things, because the main body of the Balor brown, I actually want to be Balor brown coloured, because eventually the knight isn't even going to be this dark. I'm going to layer up with some Ushabti bone and then Ceramite white on top of that. What you can see I'm doing on the screen at the minute is just using a clean paintbrush just to rub off some of the Agrax Earthshade from the armour plate itself, just so it means that when I paint the colours on top of it, I'm not having to paint over some of these darker streaks and things. Now, having said that, it is a case of, after having put these washes on, that it will help get that dirty, grubby look. So even if you paint on top of these, then you can still leave some of the darker area showing through. But it's really up to you for the stages that you want to add and how complicated you want it to be. But my advice would be airbrush any areas that you want to do quickly, or indeed find a base paint, or did use some of the Vallejo extra opaque colours or whatever, something that's kind of like a warm Balor brown colour, and then just use the wash to basically go around all the details to give them an edge, and it'll save you some time with the glazing later on. So there's the little night guy, and he's looking very grubby. And I mean, lots of people just have this stage, and that'll be fine for their gaming piece. You can see now as it's dry, so it's not got quite as much shine, and I think it looks all right like that, to be honest. But obviously, I want to paint it a little bit higher standard and have a bit of fun with it. Mainly, I'm going to be painting it in a way so that the scale works for it. So what I'm going to do here is, I actually changed my mind about what I'm doing. I did originally think to paint lots of streaking lines, and testing it out on the shield to see if I could get a bit of just kind of interesting details on there, and then I was going to apply it to the rest of the model. But it was just a test in this area to see how it would turn out like. I think the background for House Malinax is that they used the shells of some of the creatures. It might be the scorpions because that's their symbol, but it's definitely some sort of a creature from the home planet, and they grind those up and they use that as the colour for painting their knights. So they're supposed to be kind of a bony colour, and so I was doing this. I mean, yeah, they're going to be bony rather than the Balor brown. The Balor brown is just like a base colour to get a little bit of warmth in there and something to work up from to get to the light bone colour that I want. Because although I said there was issues having the Balor brown over black, if you try doing a Ushabti bone over black, you're going to find it's even worse. So I do mess about with shield. I think it's called the tilting shield, because they're stuck on. They're based on medieval knights, and obviously they had shields for tilting as well when they're fighting with lances and stuff like that. But and they've just taken that over onto these models and called them knights. So. But anyway, regardless of that, yeah. So I'm messing about putting this kind of streaking effect on to make it more detailed. Now, I could have taken my time and done it much more finely, and it probably would have worked better. But I just decided that I didn't like the look of it, and so I went for a smoother finish. Because also I wanted to do the knight quite weathered, and if you've seen the final picture that I've posted up on Instagram, you'll see that it is very heavily weathered. And if I did the weathering over this type of streaking as well, it would be just too much detail, too much visual detail. I don't mean what do I mean? I don't mean that it's like too complicated a painting process. I just mean that it looks too busy. But having said all that, so I'm doing these horrible streaking lines and things and seeing how I can make them work. But actually, because there's still a kind of a transition starting to appear there that's going from obviously dark to light, from the top to bottom on the shield, I can still... that still makes it much easier to start glazing all the colours together and blending them, because you've already started doing the work anyway. So it's not like you're wasting your time doing that. I mean, you're wasting it a little bit, but because you can blend quicker than that without putting all those lines on. But it does make it still fairly easy to blend them together. As you can see, I'm just doing these very quick layers, and it's already creating a smoother transition. Now there is going to be a PDF for this model as well. I'm considering doing a quicker version of it. I'm not sure how interesting people would find that. I'm not going to do that as a video, but I might incorporate that as the PDF as well. So in that case, what I'll be doing is purposefully just airbrushing the colour on, and seeing how quickly I could do a very similar looking model just in a much shorter amount of time. So you can see here at the minute I'm still blending the colours together, but I'm not glazing yet. Although, because I'm just using the very tip of the brush, I am applying small amounts of paint. So it's kind of like it works out like a heavy glaze, but it's kind of like an in-between a glaze and a layer, really. What you'll find is if you just did this lots and lots, you still get a very smooth transition. Although it's looking a bit, it's not looking perfect at the minute, but you get the idea. So I'm also working on a PDF for a Warlord Titan, but I'm expecting some Reaver Titans to arrive tomorrow as well. So I may do a bit of a mishmash with the PDF and add some of the Reaver Titan effects as well, because there's some different armor plates on there, particularly the carapaces, which are quite nice, and I want to try some different effects on that as well. But obviously I'm aware that people want the PDFs quite quickly for the Titans and things, so I might do two. It just depends, because obviously it takes a lot longer to paint a Warlord than a Reaver. But so we'll see what you get anyway. You can see there I just used a bit of Ceramite white, just for the very bottom of the tilting shield there. Quite often I say Ceramite white or whatever. Ceramite white is the base white paint from Games Workshop. I think actually the I can't remember what the name of the other one is now. They have another white anyway, but it's a layer paint, which is a little bit finer, because what you might find is that the Ceramite white is a bit thick and maybe chalky even to work with. It doesn't matter too much, you know, if you thin it down and you apply it nicely, but just in case, like if you're struggling with the Ceramite white, don't be afraid to use other whites. I mean, another white that's very, very good that I like to use as well is Morrow white from Formula P3. So basically what I'm saying is if you have another white from a different paint range that you like, then by all means use it. Don't feel that you're constrained to just using the colours I say on the screen. Right, so here you can see where the more tricky painting comes in. When I say tricky, it's just basically layering and glazing. But so we're going back and using the Balor brown, and we're just painting. So what I'm doing is having the middle of the top section going from one shoulder to the other being the main light point. So it's like a light line crossing straight over the carapace and both the middles of each shoulder. So you can see here that I'm painting towards the middle. The reason I'm painting towards the middle of the shield is I've mentioned this quite a lot in other videos. Whenever you take the brush off of a model is where it leaves the most paint. So you're creating you'll have a stronger colour wherever the brush leaves it. You also should be able to see that I'm using the edge of the paintbrush, not the tip. This gives a wider mark and it gives a smoother mark as well. So you can already see there just by doing these layers. There's no glazing yet or anything like that. Just carefully applied paint, but it looks kind of like a transition because some of that Agrax Earthshade at the bottom is still visible. Now I did go over it a little bit, but because it's a layer paint and there's a certain amount of transparency to it, when you apply the layer over the Agrax Earthshade, like I said, it leaves a little bit showing through, and wherever the paintbrush leaves, it's a bit thicker, so you get that transition very, very quickly. So now I'm going to the Ushabti bone. Now there's quite a big jump between Ushabti bone and Balor brown, and it's just a case of you just have to do the layers. It's the same process again, but there will be some glazing involved just to get everything nice and smooth. You might actually find it's easier if you mix a little bit of Balor brown and Ushabti bone together to create a mid tone between the two, and then so as a separate stage to what I'm doing here. It'll just make it easier to get a smooth transition. But because I want more of the model to be bone coloured, I've gone straight for the bone because I'm going to pull the colour quite far down towards the edges, but it has to be carefully applied because again you want that transition so it's lightest at the top in the middle of the shoulder. Now you can see here where I'm always struggling a little bit with the central line either side of the two panels on the shoulder, and that's because it has some little rivets on there. Now these are the same as on the 28mm model as well, but because they're painted on, they're sculpted on here, and they're so small, it would be a pain to paint random. So what happens is that you just paint over them. It's much quicker. But because it's not a flat surface, the paint kind of doesn't leave the brush smoothly and things like that. So it's a bit annoying. And that's just something that you have to deal with painting the smaller scale models. It's also annoying for me because usually what happens when I paint a 28mm knight is I cut all these details off and fill in the shoulder pads so they're just one smooth area, so I can freehand on them. Now, if I was painting one of these knights for a competition, I probably still would do that because I think that would be quite interesting to paint a small knight as a freehand piece, and it's just the size of a Space Marine. Now obviously that's not something I'm going to be too concerned with for a gaming piece that will blow up probably on the first turn. But it is something I might do in the future because I really like these models, so depending on what time I have, I'll see what I can do. So you can see here I still haven't used any glazing yet, but just keep applying the different layers, going over and over, and they're slowly working together. You can see there's a certain amount of patchiness to the colour, but I actually kind of like that rather than having a perfectly smooth, clean set of armour, it just gives it a bit more interest. I use interest a lot. I need to widen my vocabulary, but it's not as boring as just a plain flat smooth transition. So you can see here all these marks I'm doing slightly the side of the tip of the brush, not the tip itself. Sometimes I use the very tip when just as I'm finishing off and just doing very quick tiny marks, but generally it's the side of the brush and I'm just pushing the paint along. And what it does is basically allows you to use a smaller brush as if it was a bigger brush. Now you don't get as much paint in the belly of the brush, but I find when I'm using painting on very small models or small detailed areas, that you just have a little bit more control with a smaller brush, and you don't have to worry about if you push too hard, all that paint in a large well pooling out and going all over the model. So what I did there was added a bit of the Ceramite white down, and you can see it was a very strong colour. And what I'm going to do is paint with the Ushabti bone going over it. But again, the Ushabti bone is a layer colour, so I can paint over that white, and it blends the white into the Ushabti bone around it, but also it still makes it lighter because some of the white shows through. Now really I'm taking too long painting a shoulder pad on a knight like this, but what has happened is that I'm making it up as I'm going along for how I want the model to look. I mean, I had a rough idea that it's going to be a house Malinax knight basically, so the techniques and things, usually for army painting things like this, I have to paint a test model just so I can get a general idea of how I want the rest of them to look. So now you can see them glazing, and this will very quickly blend everything together. And the glazes are around about 1 part paint to 6 or 7 parts water. I really recommend that you test it yourself, because I've mentioned this before as well. Each paint pot, the paint is different consistency, and depending on how often you've used it, that some of the paint's evaporated, the paint will be a bit thicker and all sorts of things like that. You just basically have to test the paint and see if it makes the marks that you want it to. I mean, you can look at, if you just look in the wells there, you can see it's very, very runny. Just my breathing there was oh no, it's not my breathing. Alright, so what I'm doing is blowing on the shoulder pad to make the glaze dry quicker, and you can see that pushing the paint in the well palettes, and it basically behaves just like water, so it's coloured water. And there are only 2 glaze colours. It's the Balor brown and the Ushabti bone. You can just about see that it makes a mark as it goes over, but what you'll also find is it makes the mark, but then as it dries it goes more transparent, or rather it goes, the paint blends in more. I've been over this in previous videos as well. Paints dry different colours purely because of how the particles, the pigments in the paint are, in the water, the medium layer, and as it dries out, obviously they spread out differently and things like that. And just having wet and dry paint as well makes a difference to how the light affects it. So there's the shoulder done, and now I'm just using Vallejo model color black to paint the trim. Now, there's a good reason not to paint the trim before you do the glazing, because what you'll do is you'll go over the trim a lot, because glazing is it's not a super precise. I mean, you can be super precise, but you don't need to be. It's a lot quicker to be rough with it when you're painting large areas like that, and then paint over the things around them afterwards. So there's one shoulder trim done, and what you can see straight away is how that pushes the contrast really high, because you've got almost pure white on the shoulder pad itself, and then right next to it is straight black. So it really makes the colour stand out. Now, this is where it's going to get slightly annoying for you as well if you're painting this the same way. So I'm going back to the same process again, painting the Balor brown, and there's lots of small details and rivets all over these panels, but the only way you're going to keep the depth to the piece is using these layers. So it's basically, because the Rhinox hide, not the sorry, I use so much Rhinox hide it sticks in my mind. The Agrax Earthshade has shaded everything and all the details by using these layer paints and going around it. You're creating transitions around all the details, and it just makes it look so much. It gives it so much more depth, but it means it takes a lot longer to achieve the effect. So as you can see, again, I'm painting straight over the rivets, and it is really the best way to go about it. You can paint between them, but they're so small and the gaps between them are so small, it'll take a long time. You're bound to make the odd mistake and paint over some of the rivets anyway. So my theory is just paint over them, then you can fix them later on, or even don't bother fixing them later on because they're so small. You can just give them a quick touch of white paint and that'll be enough to pick them out. You have to excuse it if you can hear some background noise and things. I've got the room closed down as much as I can, but the outside world does like to intrude. So it's just a case of building up these layers, going around the details, exactly the same process as on the shoulder pad. Now, you have to remember as well that the middle of the carapace has also got to be highlighted up. So, and it has to match the shoulder pad. So when I did it, I just did one shoulder pad, and then I'm applying the effect to the rest of the model. But it might be a case that if you paint it all as one thing, it will match. You'll make it match a lot more easily. But again, I wanted to make sure that I got the effect right before I moved on. But you can see how that the Agrax Earthshade actually has made quite a nice difference, just to get, help with that transition and make it look a bit more dirty and authentic looking. And it might be a case of that you don't want to take the highlights that high, and you just want kind of sort of dusty, light browny kind of colour. And I think that actually probably would look quite nice as a night household, not going all the way up to bone. But having said that, what you will find is that once you put all the extra weathering on, and there's going to be quite a bit more weathering on the second video, is that having the higher highlights means that when you tone areas down, they'll still show through, and they'll be dulled down as well. So you just have to think a little bit ahead on how much weathering you want to do, and if you want it to still stand out after that. I'm not going to pay too much attention to the back of the carapace as it curves around all around the engine exhausts and stuff like that. One, it helps it to look dirtier, and two, it helps it to look dirtier. And it saves me having to spend a lot of time highlighting all this, the back curve section up when you're not going to see that much of it, because I'll be adding more weathering and stuff at the very bottom of the curves. So it's not really worth time spending a lot of effort highlighting sections up if you're not going to be able to see these highlighted sections. And also the same applies to the legs. What you'll find is when I paint the legs, they're not going to be quite as smooth and neat as the top of the carapace. Now, that's a problem while I'm showing off the model to people, because they tend to see it from the front in the process, and like, oh, it looks better from the top. But while you're gaming, you mostly see the model from the top anyway. Or indeed, when you're just looking at it in general, you tend to see it from like a 3/4 view and things like that. But also, because I'm putting so much weathering on the legs from the front, so it's going to be chipping and all sorts of stuff like that. And it's such a small area; it's only a few millimeters big for the largest armor plates on the leg. They're not really like Space Marines in the way the detail works, as I mentioned before, because of the scale. Like a Space Marine's leg is actually quite large and smooth with the amount of armor on it, whereas these guys have very small, clean areas, and it's all like trim, and the panels are separated, and there's lots of just metal parts on the backs of the legs and things like that. So you actually have a much smaller area of clean armor to paint. Everything's got details separating it all out, which means that you just don't get the space to do quick, easy transitions. So you can see here how it's all starting to come together with the lighting, using the Ushabti bone now on top. So at this stage as well, all I'm using is a size 1 Artisopus brush again. My favourite size of brush. You can do a lot with it, and you can see the points quite sharp on it. Although I've used this one a bit now, so it's worn down a bit from what it was. So just adding a bit of water to my wet palette again. Speaking of the wet palette, actually, on a slightly different note, I have had a few issues with this wet palette after I've used it a bit longer now, and I do actually get mold spots appearing after probably 4 or 5 days of using the paper. I've not had it like that before, especially considering it's supposed to be a mold resistant. Well, saying that it's just the foam that's supposed to be mold resistant, but the mold's appearing on the paper. I've tried putting some copper coins in as well, and there's still little spots of mold growing on. So I am finding that I can't use the paper on the wet palette very long before I'm having to change it for a new one, which is a little bit disappointing. So you can see, because of this painting technique, it's a lot of layers, but it does have quite a nice effect. Yeah, you can see you get the transitions and the contrasts nicely, and the details in between, with where the Agrax Earthshade has gone into all the recesses. And because I covered the model in and then I've gone over it in those layers, it just makes it look dirty in those recesses as well. It's not just a case of having lines going around there, so all the details picked out, but it does make it makes it look more authentic with like kind of greasy sort of look to it. So what you'll see here for the glazing is, what I'm going to tend to be doing is, when I use the Balor brown to glaze, I glaze down into the shadows, and where I glaze with the Ushabti bone, I glaze up into the highlights. And again, that's to do with the process of the paint. There's more paint leaves where the brush is removed from the model. So now it's just a case of doing the final shoulder pad. Then there'll just be small glazing just to tidy up the whole the carapace. But what you'll also find is when all of the trim and other pieces are painted black, it'll look neater as well. And again, paying attention to as I apply the Ushabti bone before, I was painting it in kind of the pattern round, following the shape of the armour, because that helps to kind of enhance the highlight shapes. Now you can see on the wet palette there. So what happens is, as the paint dries, then I add more water, and what you get more and more of the paint drying at the outside, and the pigment, some of it sticks to the paper and things like that. And eventually, you're changing the properties of the paint, so it's not as regardless if you're adding water or not, the marks that it makes aren't the same. So you can get nice. So it almost starts to turn into a glaze basically as you're applying the paint to the model. So it gets easier and easier to get these nice transitions down. But if you ever want to then go back to use that paint to make strong marks, very fine marks and things like that, especially for things like freehand, what you'll find is that you can't make them because the properties of the paint have changed so much that they don't, they just won't make those marks anymore. So always pay attention to what the paint looks like on your palette, and because sometimes you might be trying to paint and you get frustrated and you're like, I can't do this. Why won't my paint do what the way it's looking on the video? And it can be a case of you've had to keep watering it down as it's drying out, because paint does dry out while you're using a wet palette. I know they keep it wetter for longer, but it's still in the process of evaporating. And so it might just be a case of, if you can't make the mark that you want to, that you need to put fresh paint down onto the palette. Now for this video, there's no weathering going to be applied. It's just getting all of these colours down. The second video is already completed, so I'll be uploading that in the next day or so as well. But it might be a case of when you finish this stage that you don't want to weather it at all. And I actually think the model looks quite nice without weathering, so it's purely your preference. I wanted to see what the model would look like with weathering, and I do prefer it, especially when you look at it in the hand. So there is always a difference between when you look at a model and the photos on the screens on the internet, and when you're holding the model in your hand. And what generally happens is models look better when you see them in the hand, because you don't really appreciate when you see them on the screen exactly how fine the painting is. And I get this effect a lot when people turn up to Golden Demons and things for the first time. They've seen all the models online and they think they know what models look like, and they get there and they're amazed when they see them, and they're like, oh, it's much smaller than I realised. Yeah, so just be aware of that, like the weathering when you see it in the photos at the end of the second video. It's big, obviously, to allow you to see it, but when you see it in the hand, it's painted for the appropriate scale, so it's actually very, very small. So here we are. I've spent a little bit more time there. There has been a time jump. So I spent a bit more time glazing it, and I filled in the rest of the black trim. Now, you can see the black trim has made a huge difference to the contrast. And actually the contrast is too high at the moment, but that's fine, because obviously I'm not going to leave the black trim as being flat black. I'm going to paint it grey, well, highlighted black, that kind of thing. And once the weathering goes on top of it as well, it will add a little bit of colour to the black as well, so it all looks a lot more interesting. What I'm doing here, if you can see around my hair getting in this shot there, is I'm just edge highlighting some of the details. Now these are very, very small lines to edge highlight. You'll need a very small amount of paint on the tip of the brush, and I'm only painting the lower edges, so it's where the light would catch if it was shining straight down on top, but it just helps to pick them out, and I just prefer the look, basically. Again, it's not something that you have to do if you don't want to, but I do like it. Again, apologies for my hair getting in the shot, but it's just a case of that I had to get so close to the model to see exactly what I'm doing. I am quite short-sighted. Oh dear. So there you can see just those little edge highlights around the... I'm not sure if that's an access panel or... Yeah, because I think that the central canopy opens where the the portal is. That's where the pilot gets in. So I think this must just be an access panel to some internal components. But anyway, what it does is it picks out the details a bit more. Again, you know, makes things look more interesting. This panel line in particular is very nice if you edge highlight it, because it contrasts against the darker colour near the base of the trim, and it's a thicker line as well, so it particularly works nicely with the edge highlight. Again, those little rivets on right next to the panel lines are a pain for this kind of thing, because the brush does tend to catch them. But there's not a lot you can do about it. You just got to live with it. Again, another panel line around the handholds going up to the door in the middle. So when I set up, paint the lower edge and side edges as well, because side edges tend to catch the light. I mean, you don't have to be completely realistic, but it does help to pick out these details. So I'm just going to use the white on the edges closer to the centre of the carapace, just because I've already highlighted up to a lighter section on the centre of the carapace anyway. So using the white will pick out the edges more clearly, because it's already pure bone. Whereas the lower sections I used the Ushabti bone, not the white, because that would make too high a contrast. It's quite important that actually just use the Ushabti bone for the lower details when you're picking out the highlights, and then you can use white when it's on the highest highlight areas to pick them out. So there we are. I've just gone back and painted in a couple more of the black areas and started on the legs and a few of the other armor panels and things. I mean, it's entirely the same as what I've just been doing on the carapace, so you haven't really missed that much. But now the gun I found a little bit more tricky. The detail kind of softens a bit. Well, on this model the detail softens a bit there, because I got a bit of the glue going over the edge. And it softened the details, so it made my life a bit more tricky. But what I end up doing is I just end up weathering this area to blend it all in. it's a tricky area as well. So what you've probably noticed is that I'm painting the whole of the model with it all stuck together. And again, I'm doing that because it's a gaming piece. And also, I mean, it's not like when the model's all stuck together that you can't really get the brush around anywhere. It's a little bit more tricky around these parts of the gun, but they're kind of shadowed anyway, not in main visual area. So I don't really see the point of painting the model in sections. I'm not even sure that I would paint it separately if I was doing it for a Golden Demon piece. Because again, you can reach most of the areas where the brush is. It's just a little bit more fiddly. But so there is one benefit of having the model stuck together. When you're doing lighting, you can make sure that all the lighting is cohesive when it's all stuck together. What you sometimes find is if you paint a model and it's all in sections, you stick it together and then you've not got the lighting quite right. And so you may have done like perfect blends and all these lovely lighting effects and things like that, and then you stick the model together and it looks a little bit jarring because you haven't quite lined it up because you painted it all separately. So there are benefits to painting it separately, and those benefits are you can obviously get the paintbrush around all of the gaps and things, and you can focus on areas and make them look really nice, but it does risk you getting the highlight points wrong. Now that's only if you're painting it like this, where there's transitions into highlights and things like that. If you're painting it all edge highlight, then you don't have to worry about that because there's no lighting direction, so you can just go crazy painting each section individually and not worry about it. But if you want to do it so that there is a consistent lighting direction, or make sure the piece looks correct as one piece, then yeah, it does help if it's all stuck together. Now, of course, you can kind of compromise on that if you're painting it in separate sections, and the way to do that is you have to keep stopping, blue tacking the part to the model to double check, or holding it against it if you can. But you have to keep doing that every now and then just to double check that you're getting everything right. So again, it's the same process I've been doing for the carapace that you've seen all over. Also, you may have noticed when I started the video, I was using my little model holder, and I do prefer to use the model holder, but I don't have the adapter to put the bases in it. I mean, I could do a workaround, but it was just a bit fiddly. So I was just blue tacking it to it, and and on top of that, it was the top of the holder was getting in the way of the video. So for your benefit, I removed the holder, but at least now hopefully you can see it a bit more clearly anyway. So again, you can see the shin armor plates. They curve around to the front. I'm having the highlights coming from the front. So it's exactly the same process as the carapace and top. Now, if you remember early in the video, I mentioned that it's not worth spending a lot of time on those leg plates at the front because I'm going to weather it. So you can see at the moment they look quite rough. They're also fiddly to paint because those little kind of fleur-de-lis type shape bits on the trim, they're sort of exaggerated detail for the scale, and they're just awkward to paint around, you know. And then you've got the rivets and the paint and the armor panels in between each section, and the little vents as well. Yeah, if you wanted to paint that perfectly, it'll take a while, even though it's a small area. But again, if you've seen the finished photo that I put on Instagram, I will put one on Patreon as well, so you can see it close up. But these armor panels are quite heavily weathered, so I mean you can barely see the bone colour on them actually. So it's really not worth spending a lot of time blending these bits together. But if you wanted to paint the whole of the armor panels without any weathering or very minor weathering, then you have to do the same process again as I've used on the top of the carapace. Again, you can see the wet palette drying out just a little bit, so more water to keep it flowing. So originally when I did this video, I was going to do it as one whole video, and I did edit it that way to begin with, but over 2 hours long, I thought no one wants to sit through that in one go, and I didn't want to do a voiceover for 2 hours, so I've cut it in half. So the next video is already edited and done. I just have to do the voiceover for it, so it should be coming this weekend. You can see I'm just glazing on a little bit as well. You can see the blend lines and things on these armor, on these leg armor plates. But as I keep saying, it's not worth spending that much time on them because of the weathering. So there's not actually that much longer left on this this part of the video. This will be the stage to just get the armor plates done. That's all the hard work, if you like. Then after that, the second video is where all the interesting things happen. So you're going to get like the black trim, and then there's the weathering, the transfers, the base as well. So there's quite a lot that happens in the second video. Whereas all you've seen in this video is the bone coloured armour. But it's quite an important stage, this, so I thought I'd better show it to you. can see when I'm holding the model there. Usually I'd be having the model holder and the arm on the model holder curves just over the top of the model, so you don't actually touch the model when you hold the top of it. But I'm trying not to touch the armor panels too much. I'm actually touching the whole thing by the look of it, but I'm trying to touch it very lightly, and when I think about it, I'm just trying to touch the exhaust stacks and the black details rather than the armor panels themselves, because again, the sweat on your fingers, it eats into the paint, it leaves it shiny, it does all sorts of bad things to it. It's for the same reason when you go to an art gallery they tell you not to touch the paintings. So that's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching. Part 2 will be up very soon.